2020 was a year marred by civil unrest here in the United States. Sparked by the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed black man killed at the hands of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, riots and violence erupted and spread throughout the country in protest.
Washington, D.C.-based independent journalist Richie McGinniss was in the trenches then, traveling to different cities struck by violence, including Waukesha, Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, New York City, and Philadelphia, just to name a few. He put pen to paper, writing a forthcoming book, The Riot Diet, on the civil unrest of 2020 and 2021. The book is being released November 7th. Joining us now to dive in deeper is Richie McGinniss. Richie, thank you for joining us again on Rising.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I believe you also covered some of the inauguration protests in 2016 against Donald Trump. Obviously, we are just a few days out from the election on November 5th. From your experience covering these situations, what would be your prediction for what might happen if either Trump or Kamala ends up winning?
Well, I guess we can start with Trump, since you mentioned 2016. I think the difference between 2016 and 2024 is that, in 2016, people really didn't anticipate that Trump was going to win. I mean, the polls were putting Hillary Clinton, like at a 90% chance, over 90% chance of winning. And so when it did happen, it wasn't as if, the whole country was ready for that scenario. So we did see some small scale, there was a little bit of looting. There were a couple of cars that were torched in downtown DC immediately after Trump's victory. And then there was also some unrest during the inauguration. But this time around, I think that, after 8 years of Trump being in the picture, it's going to be a much different story because, people, I think, have soundly in their minds the possibility of Trump winning. And so if however many days it takes for them to count the votes, I do think that the backlash, if Trump wins, will be more significant than it was in 2016. As for if Kamala Harris wins, I think we look back to 2020, which I was on the ground for not only all the BLM unrest, but also the MAGA unrest that took place during the Stop the Steal rallies in DC, as well as January 6th, where I was on the ground covering the events for that. And what you saw there was basically, these the election results coming in, them taking a significant amount of time to count the votes, and basically the escalating of anger on the Trump side of things as things didn't go in their favor. So I think we're probably going to see a scenario that's more similar to 2020 in that it will take, some states are already predicting that it's going to take some time to count the votes. So there will be this interregnum period during which we don't know who the next president of the United States is going to be. And as the votes are being counted, basically I think both sides will be gearing up for potential loss.
And Richie, to that point, particularly in the event of a Harris victory, I guess it sounds like from how you look at it that there's not much really that can be done to ameliorate that risk if there's a Harris victory, because the idea of protesting the election or contesting the election has been, so to speak, set up by former President Trump in advance. So you don't really think at this stage there's any way to avoid that kind of scenario if indeed Kamala Harris wins?
Yeah, I think, well, the one thing that you can do to avoid it, and this is what I saw over the course of the Stop the Steal rallies, is law enforcement being prepared for an massive influx of people coming to DC to protest, as well as the counter protesters. As you well know, DC isn't exactly a Trump supporting stronghold. So on the first Stop the Steal, what we saw was a lot of people leaving that initial rally, which was down around the National Mall. And then as they were returning to their hotels, et cetera, they didn't quite realize, being from around the country, that they were walking straight through BLM Plaza, which, while wearing a MAGA hat, was effectively walking into a hornet's nest. So after the first Stop the Steal, what we saw was a lot of small-scale violence and assaults in and around BLM Plaza. And then Stop the Steal 2, which took place in December, that's when the Proud Boys came in force, and everybody was really ready for like a street battle. And we literally saw street brawls. I mean, it felt like we were covering some kind of medieval battle out right in front of Farragut Square, right by the White House. And so by the time January 6th came around, the question that I had when I arrived on the scene is how come I'm better prepared than all the police? I had my gas mask, my bulletproof vest, my bulletproof backpack, my bulletproof helmet. And it just seemed to me that in the case of both Stop the Steal 2 and January 6th, Metro police were not reinforced, Capitol police were not reinforced in the way that they should have been. So hopefully the one difference this time around will be that law enforcement is really geared up and ready for that influx of protest and unrest.
That is especially interesting given what we know now about the FBI's tracking of some of the communications of people who were planning ahead of January 6th. Can you speak a little bit about how these riots on both sides get organized, and are the people who participate in them usually repeat offenders, or are there new people coming into the fold? Based on what we've seen about Antifa, for example, around the country, it seems to be generally a smaller group of very passionate people who are showing up consistently at all of these different riots.
Absolutely. And I think in both cases, on both sides of the political spectrum, what you had is a smaller group. Antifa is obviously this group that's very hard to define. It's not many people when you're out on the street are going to say, hey, are you Antifa? They're going to say, oh, yeah, of course I'm Antifa. But I was in a lot of these Telegram chats on both sides, both the Proud Boys and what you would call an Antifa group, anarchist groups who were planning these events. And what I saw in both the BLM case and in the case of the Stop the Steal rallies is it doesn't take that many people who are very serious about agitating and creating confrontations with the police in order for that to spread. I call it like the Lord of the Flies effect, which is if you see one or two people from your quote unquote political tribe get billy clubbed or pepper sprayed by police, then this different part of your brain, this animal reptilian part of your brain is what gets turned on. And once that fight or flight response is triggered and you have thousands of people surrounding an outnumbered group of police, things can get pretty bad, as we saw on January 6th. So I think, the FBI, as far as what law enforcement is monitoring, they were flying a drone and a Cessna over Kenosha, which I was also covering. And the question that begs is, if they're doing all this monitoring, and if they have all this information about what the most extreme elements of these various groups are doing, then why weren't places like Kenosha and the Capitol better reinforced for what they knew was coming?
And there's no question that that's a valid issue to raise, Richie, but do you have an answer to that yourself? What do you think the reason is?
What do I think the reason is that they weren't properly prepared?
Yeah.
That's the question that I've been asking myself over the 3 years that I've been writing these two books. This first book covers the BLM, second one covers January 6th and all the MAGA demonstrations. Well, for one, I think what we saw in the case of BLM is basically this battle between the federal government, Trump and his quote unquote stormtroopers, and the local governments, the local police departments, local mayors, and local governors who didn't want, Trump to bring his feds in. And in the case of Washington, D.C., it was very similar in that you have a Democratic mayor, Mayor Muriel Bowser, and you have federal government that's seated here. So the difference here is now that we have an incumbent president who's a Democrat, and I don't see those political battles taking place in exactly the same way that they did then. But I do think that a lot of what happened back in 2020 had to do with kind of this political gamesmanship that was going on many levels above the street level. And as a result, in a place like Kenosha, the National Guard was allegedly there, according to the Democratic governor. But they were just surrounding the courthouse and they weren't protecting any of the businesses surrounding the area. So even in the cases where we did have like federal National Guard in place, their goal wasn't necessarily to protect anything beyond the courthouse that was, the ire of the protesters. So, I guess if I were to attribute one singular reason to why it is that we saw the law enforcement unprepared during that time period, it would be just simple political gamesmanship.
There's been recent reporting from some DC-based outlets that people are preparing to actually leave the city in advance of Election Day because of their concern about potential violence breaking out. If you were giving advice to people who are in the area, what would your advice be?
My advice to people who are in the area is, if you're going to go check things out, keep in mind what I just mentioned, which is the Lord of the Flies effect. Like once tear gas starts flying and pepper spray starts going into people's eyes, things change very quickly, and it's very easy to get caught up in that mob mentality. So, if you are politically active, if you want to get out there to support this candidate or that, just keep in mind that the only thing that violence will do, confrontations with police will do, is make your side look worse. And if you're just a resident who's just trying to stay safe, I would stay away from all the major areas that will probably be the centers of protest, namely the White House around the election time. And then as we near the counting of the votes, the Capitol and that whole National Mall area.
I just want to take a sort of big picture view before we let you go, Richie. In terms of, polarization or an undercurrent of violence, whenever people talk about the present day, where we are right now, sometimes people take a very, very dark view of it, think it's getting worse all the time. There's even some possibility of wider scale civil disturbance. Some people mention civil war. And then on the flip side, I guess you could say, you have people talking about how, well, America's been through lots of tumultuous times before. The most frequently cited is the late 1960s, when you had political assassinations, a lot of civil strife and so forth. How bad is the situation right now in your judgment?
Well, I do think I would probably fall into that latter category that, we'll make it through this. And I don't think that we're heading for a full-scale kinetic civil war. With that being said, the difference today is that everybody has, in their pockets on their phones, they have like complete access to everything that's going on, and also these algorithms on these various social media platforms that really drive people into one of two echo chambers. So what's happening now is what's happening on the street is then being selectively edited and put into these two completely different realities on American social media feeds. And so I do think that, we will make it through this, but as we saw with the George Floyd protests and riots, and as we saw on January 6th, it's really, really easy for people to coordinate large events and for people to get really, really angry based upon, the clips that are coming through their social media feed. So I would just caution people to, when they see, a 6 or 10-second video come through their feed, try to take a second look at, okay, what was the bigger context around this situation? We had a couple of assaults, I remember, during the Stop the Steal 2 rally where MAGA guys were punched. And if you saw the longer clip, it turned out, that the guy had just kicked a woman. And so once you see the broader context, a lot of times it's not just as black and white as people think based on that first instinct.
All right, Richie McGinniss, author of Riot Diet. I believe that's available for pre-order on Amazon, so check it out. Thanks for joining us today on Rising.
I appreciate you having me.